Stalingrad, trapped in hell, how soldiers survived WW2's bloodiest battle. The Battle of Stalingrad, a confrontation of unparalleled ferocity during the Second World War, unfolded between the late summer of 1942 and the early winter of 1943. Its genesis lay in the German strategic offensive for 1942, Fall Blau Case Blue, initiated on June 28. This operation aimed primarily at securing the Caucasian oil fields, with a secondary objective assigned to Army Group B, the capture of Stalingrad. This city, bearing the name of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, was not only a significant industrial hub but also controlled vital transport routes along the Volga River. For Adolf Hitler, its capture represented both a strategic and a potent symbolic victory. By late August 1942, elements of the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, stood at the threshold of Stalingrad. The assault commenced with a devastating aerial campaign by Luftwaffe 4, beginning on August 23. This bombardment reduced vast swathes of the city to rubble, inflicted immense civilian casualties, and inadvertently created the very landscape that would define the subsequent urban conflict. Despite the destruction, Soviet resolve hardened, significantly influenced by Stalin's Order No. 227, not one step back, issued on July 28, which forbade retreat under penalty of severe punishment and galvanized defenders to resist at all costs. As German ground forces pushed into the city in mid-September, the nature of the battle transformed into savage, close-quarters combat. General Vasily Chukov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army tasked with holding the city, masterfully employed the ruins for defense. His forces developed specialized tactics for street fighting, a brutal form of warfare the Germans termed Rattenkrieg, rat war. Control of the city fragmented into desperate struggles for individual structures, cellars, and sewer systems. Landmarks such as the Mamayev Kurgan Heights, the imposing grain elevator, and the sprawling factory complex comprising the Red October Steel Factory, the Barricadi Ordnance Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory became synonymous with relentless carnage, frequently changing hands amidst fierce fighting. Through the autumn months of September and October, the Sixth Army ground forward, inexorably pushing the Soviet defenders towards the Volga's western bank. At the apex of their advance, German forces controlled approximately 90% of the ravaged city. Yet they could not extinguish the final pockets of Soviet resistance which clung tenaciously to the riverbank. These beleaguered units were sustained by perilous nighttime crossings of the Volga, receiving reinforcements and meager supplies under constant German artillery fire and aerial attack. Survival for soldiers on both sides became an exercise in adaptation to hellish conditions. Combat devolved into battles between small, specialized units, German Sturmpioneer and Soviet storm groups, adept at house-to-house fighting with grenades, submachine guns, and flamethrowers. The ruined cityscape provided ideal terrain for snipers, who inflicted a steady toll. The legendary, though possibly embellished, duel between Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev and a German counterpart became emblematic of this ever-present threat. Shelter was sought in bombed-out basements and hastily dug earthworks. Logistics were a nightmare. The Soviets risked the Volga crossings, while German supply lines stretched thin through contested ruins. Basic necessities like clean water were scarce, and the psychological burden of constant shelling, sudden death, and omnipresent decay was immense, testing the limits of human endurance and unit cohesion. While the Sixth Army bled in the streets of Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, directed by Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, prepared a decisive counterstroke, Operation Uranus. Launched on November 19, 1942, powerful Soviet forces struck north and south of the city, targeting the weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies protecting the German flanks. These Axis allied forces, often poorly equipped and demoralized, crumbled under the assault. 4 days later, on November 23, Soviet armored spearheads met near the town of Kalakh-na-Donu, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Axis soldiers, predominantly from the German Sixth Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, were trapped in a vast pocket, the Kessel. Hitler, swayed by Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring's assurances that the trapped army could be sustained by air, forbade Paulus to attempt a breakout. This decision sealed the Sixth Army's fate. The Luftwaffe's air transport capacity proved woefully inadequate for the task, hampered by harsh weather, formidable Soviet air defenses, and the progressive loss of vital airfields within the pocket, notably Potomnik and later Gumrak. Deliveries fell drastically short of the minimum required tonnage. Inside the Kessel, the situation deteriorated catastrophically with the arrival of the brutal Russian winter. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Rations were slashed repeatedly, forcing desperate soldiers to consume their draft horses, then any stray animals they could find. Fuel supplies vanished, leaving troops exposed to the lethal cold, huddled in frozen dugouts, burning whatever flammable materials remained. Medical facilities collapsed under the strain. Wounded men often died from exposure or infection due to the lack of supplies and basic care. Frostbite, typhus, and dysentery ravaged the weakened soldiers. Ammunition dwindled, silencing artillery and limiting defensive capabilities. Hope evaporated, especially after Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's relief effort, Operation Winterstorm, was halted by Soviet resistance in late December, miles short of the pocket. Amidst the starvation, freezing cold, and despair, discipline frayed, though pockets of resistance endured. Survival became a primal struggle against the elements and starvation, dependent on scavenging, seeking minimal shelter, and the sheer will to endure. In early January 1943, the Soviets initiated Operation Ring, the final offensive to liquidate the Kessel. A surrender ultimatum, offered on January 8th, was rejected by Paulus under orders from Hitler. The Soviet assault commenced on January 10th, systematically crushing the remaining German defenses and splitting the pocket. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a promotion laden with the expectation of suicide rather than surrender, as no German field marshal had ever been taken captive. Paulus chose survival, surrendering his headquarters staff in the southern sector on January 31st. The last organized resistance in the northern sector ceased on February 2, 1943, bringing the Battle of Stalingrad to its conclusion. The aftermath was grim. Of the approximately 91,000 Axis soldiers who entered Soviet captivity, the vast majority perished from disease, malnutrition, and the hardships of the prison camps. Only around 5,000 to 6,000 would eventually see their homelands again. Soviet losses were equally staggering, exceeding 1 million casualties throughout the campaign. The battle represented a decisive strategic turning point on the Eastern Front, halting the German advance and initiating the Red Army's long, arduous push towards Berlin. For the soldiers caught within its vortex, Stalingrad was an ordeal of unimaginable suffering, a descent into a frozen inferno where survival was measured against the absolute extremes of deprivation and violence.